Princess Anne just pulled off one of the most quietly decisive moves in modern royal history, and the fact that almost no one saw it coming is honestly the most interesting part of all of this. We're not talking about a public announcement. We're not talking about a carefully placed story in a friendly newspaper. We're talking about a single signature on a document inside a private palace office that instantly changed who controls one of the late Queen's most personal estates. And the fallout was immediate. Within hours, according to nearly every royal commentator who has covered this story, phones were ringing across the institution. Senior court officials found themselves out of the loop, and the people who believed they had a permanent seat at that table suddenly realized the table had been moved without them. The person who ended up holding the keys to this particular property was Catherine, Princess of Wales. And the people left standing outside with no explanation, no warning, and no recourse, that's where the whole thing gets genuinely complicated, because this was never really about land. It was about who Queen Elizabeth's family trusted to carry her legacy forward. And apparently the answer to that question made some people absolutely furious. Before we go any further, if you're enjoying this kind of deep dive into royal dynamics, subscribe and join us here at Crown Watch. We cover these stories every single week. Now let's talk about what actually happened, because the details are considerably more interesting than the headlines suggest. Princess Anne has spent her entire public life building one consistent reputation: duty. She doesn't do drama. She doesn't do the whisper network that so much of palace life runs on. She doesn't plant stories or manage perceptions through carefully timed leaks. She shows up, does the work, and goes home. That has been her reality for decades. So when she made this decision about Queen Elizabeth's private estate, it carried a weight that only comes from someone who has never once been accused of acting on impulse. The estate itself is not some incidental piece of property. This was the place where Queen Elizabeth went to actually breathe, to step back from the crown for a moment and exist as a person rather than a monarch. Every garden path, every cottage, every beam in the main house was shaped by her direct choices over many years. This was her sanctuary, and for a long time, there had been what you might call quiet assumptions within certain palace circles about where it would eventually land. Particular factions had more or less operated on the belief that the property would naturally flow toward whoever was closest to the current reign. Plans were floated, future events were imagined. Private arrangements were discussed as though they were already settled. Everyone assumed the traditional power structure would simply hold. Princess Anne looked at all of that, and by every account, said no. The moment that document was placed on the table, and Anne pressed her signet ring into the sealing wax, the entire assumed inheritance structure collapsed. There were no preliminary committee meetings, no advisory board consultations, no quiet signals sent out to gauge the reaction. She moved with what insiders described as complete precision, cutting through layers of court procedure to execute something that felt less like a property transfer and more like a statement. And the person she named was Catherine. Not because Catherine had lobbied for it, not because she was the loudest voice in the room, but because in Anne's assessment, Catherine represents the next chapter of this institution. That was the logic. That was the reasoning. And when you lay it out clearly, it holds together. Why would you leave the late Queen's personal sanctuary in the hands of anyone other than the person who will actually be guiding the monarchy forward? But that's where it gets messy, because not everyone read it that way. The reaction from Camilla's wider circle was, by all accounts, volcanic. And it's worth being careful here, because much of this comes from what royal commentators have pieced together through sources and insider accounts rather than official confirmation. But the picture that takes shape is one of genuine shock and fury. These were people who believed their proximity to the throne guaranteed them a voice in decisions like this one. They had spent months, in some cases years, building influence and negotiating access to private royal properties. They had made commitments behind closed doors based on the assumption that the established order would be respected. Then Princess Anne sat down, signed a piece of paper, and made all of it irrelevant in one afternoon. The sense of betrayal in that room apparently reached a point where a porcelain teacup ended up on the parquet floor. That detail tells you something. You don't shatter crockery over good news. That's the kind of reaction that happens when someone realizes the game they thought they were playing no longer exists. What makes this so striking from the outside is that the anger doesn't appear to be about the land itself. Camilla's family is not in any kind of financial difficulty. This isn't a dispute over acreage or agricultural income or building valuations. It's about relevance. It's the dawning understanding that the influence they had built is tied to the present moment, to this specific reign, and that the future belongs to people who aren't them. Catherine's position, by contrast, is not subject to the same kind of uncertainty. She is going to be queen. That is not a possibility or a projection. It is the actual direction of the institution. And Princess Anne just made it clear that when it comes to protecting Queen Elizabeth's personal legacy, the future counts for more than the present. To understand why this decision landed the way it did, you have to understand the history of the estate itself and what it represented to the people who had been quietly orbiting it for years. Royal properties at this level are never simply real estate. They carry weight that goes far beyond any monetary valuation. They hold memory. They hold association. They hold the unspoken suggestion that whoever controls them is connected to something permanent, something that outlasts any individual reign. That is precisely why so many factions within the extended palace world had been paying attention to this particular property since the very early months of King Charles's accession. The transition from one monarch to the next always reshuffles the informal hierarchies that govern who has access, who gets invited, and who is quietly consulted on decisions that never make it into any official record. And in the months following Queen Elizabeth's death, those reshuffles were happening constantly, in ways both visible and invisible to the outside world. Camilla's family had read the situation and positioned accordingly. Sources familiar with the internal dynamics of that period describe a deliberate effort to build presence around the estate, not through any overt claim of ownership, but through the kind of gradual incremental proximity that eventually starts to look like belonging. Visits became more frequent. Conversations about the property's future became more pointed. The assumption that their access would persist and perhaps expand was never stated openly, but it was there in the way certain meetings were run and certain plans were discussed. Princess Anne watched all of this with the particular clarity of someone who has been navigating palace dynamics for longer than most of the people in those rooms have been alive. She has seen influence rise and fall around enough monarchs to know exactly what it looks like when proximity starts to be confused with authority. And from everything that has been reported by royal observers who covered this period closely, her concern was not abstract. She had reason to believe that without a clear and legally robust transfer of stewardship, the estate's future was genuinely at risk of being shaped by people whose interest in it had very little to do with preserving what Queen Elizabeth had built there. The timeline behind this decision is worth paying attention to because this was not a sudden impulse. According to the accounts that have emerged, Princess Anne had been carrying concerns for some time. She had apparently identified a growing pattern of private commercial interests beginning to press against the estate's boundaries. Outside figures who viewed the property not as a sanctuary, but as an asset, something that could be developed, leveraged, or divided over time. Anne's calculation was not complicated. If the estate remained tied to the shifting personal influences around the current reign, it would eventually lose the character that made it worth protecting in the first place. The only way to genuinely secure it was to place it in hands that could not be moved, could not be pressured, and could not be worked around. Catherine was the only person who fit that description. She carries public trust. She has generational stability on her side, and she is not going anywhere. What is worth sitting with for a moment is the personal cost of that calculation for Anne herself. She is not a woman who makes decisions in order to be praised for them. She has never played to the gallery, but even by her standards, this was a move that required a particular kind of resolve, because she knew with absolute certainty that it would make powerful people angry. People who are capable of making their displeasure felt in ways that are rarely direct, but are always noticed. Anne accepted that. She stepped into that line of fire deliberately and without any apparent hesitation. And for people who have followed her career closely, that willingness to absorb institutional friction in service of a longer-term outcome is perhaps the defining quality of her public life. Then came the twist that takes this from palace drama to something considerably harder to argue with. Once the initial shock settled and Camilla's circle began making noise about challenging the transfer, researchers went looking through the archives for any precedent or legal gap that might support their position. What they found instead was a small, red leather envelope at the bottom of a file box, sealed with royal wax and dated years before any of this conflict had surfaced. Inside was a codicil, a legal addendum written in Queen Elizabeth's own handwriting, and the contents made every objection moot before it had properly been raised. The late Queen had not only anticipated this exact situation, she had already decided how it should be resolved. The estate had been designated as an unalterable sanctuary for the future of the crown, permanently protected from claims by extended family members or temporary court factions. Catherine wasn't just Anne's choice. She was Queen Elizabeth's choice, documented in the late Queen's own hand, sealed and waiting in an archive for the moment it would be needed. That is the detail that changes the weight of everything else. Up until that discovery, the people opposing the transfer could frame it as an overreach, as Princess Anne acting unilaterally without proper consideration. But once that envelope was opened, the argument had nowhere left to go. You cannot claim you're defending a monarch's wishes when the monarch's actual words contradict everything you're saying. You cannot challenge a decision on the grounds of precedent when the precedent was established by the Queen herself in a document that had been sitting undisturbed in a palace archive. Every objection, every protest, every question raised about whether Catherine's appointment had been properly considered, all of it ran directly into the wall of Queen Elizabeth's written directive. The legal position was solid, the decision was final, and everyone who had spent weeks fighting it suddenly had to face the fact that they hadn't been opposing Princess Anne at all. They had been opposing a plan set in motion years earlier by a woman who knew precisely what would happen after she was gone. The discovery of that document also raised questions that nobody in Camilla's circle seemed prepared to answer publicly. If they had been so confident in their position, why had no one checked the archives before launching their challenge? The legal teams that had been assembled to contest the transfer apparently had no prior knowledge of the codicil's existence, which means the entire campaign to reverse Princess Anne's decision had been built on the assumption that no such safeguard existed. That assumption turned out to be wrong in the most definitive possible way, and the silence that followed the archive discovery, the sudden absence of the loud voices that had been demanding a review, told its own story without anyone having to say a word. The more you look at Anne's move, the clearer its logic becomes. She didn't simply transfer a property, she built a barrier around it. By placing Catherine in control with this kind of legal foundation beneath it, she made it functionally impossible for commercial interests or shifting palace factions to ever reach the estate. Catherine's position is not contingent on who currently has the king's ear or which relationships are running warm at any given moment. She is beyond that. Anne understood that protecting Queen Elizabeth's sanctuary permanently required placing it beyond the reach of palace politics entirely. That is not a petty maneuver. That is someone who has spent her entire life watching how these institutions actually work and acting accordingly. For Catherine, the weight of this is not small. She is not celebrating. She is not doing a victory lap. The accounts that have come out describe her sitting quietly with the estate plans, going through agricultural reports and conservation proposals, fully aware that every choice she makes from this point forward will be watched by people who are waiting for her to stumble. Walking those tree-lined paths where Queen Elizabeth once found solitude, the responsibility settles in a way that probably resists easy description. This is not a gift. It is a trust. And by all indications, she understands the difference completely. There is something worth noting about the specific way Catherine has approached the early days of this stewardship. She has not made any grand announcements about her vision for the estate. She has not given interviews about what the property means to her or how she plans to honor the late Queen's connection to it. What has been observed by the small number of staff and advisors who have accompanied her during her initial visits to the grounds is someone who listens more than she speaks, who asks detailed questions about the history of specific areas, and who walks through spaces with a kind of careful attention that suggests she is trying to understand what she has inherited before deciding what to do with it. That is not the behavior of someone who sees this as a prize. It is the behavior of someone who takes the responsibility seriously from the first day. Prince William, for his part, has apparently made his position known to anyone who has asked. Any attempt to undermine Catherine's appointment or to question Princess Anne's authority in executing this transfer will be met with total resistance. He watched his grandmother build this place. He knows what it meant to her. And he has no intention of letting anyone reduce it to something that can be traded or leveraged. The position from that quarter is clear. This is settled, this is right, and it is not going to be relitigated. William's involvement in this situation is worth examining a little more carefully because his role has not been that of a passive observer. Sources close to the Prince of Wales have indicated that he was kept informed of Princess Anne's intentions in advance, and that his support for the decision was not reluctant or merely procedural. He actively endorsed it. For William, the question of who stewards the late Queen's personal properties is directly connected to the broader project of defining what the monarchy looks like in the decades ahead. He has been consistent in the years since his grandmother's death in pushing against the kind of informal influence structures that allow extended family members or court-adjacent figures to shape institutional decisions without any formal accountability. This transfer, from his perspective, was not just the right outcome for one estate. It was a demonstration of the principle that the future of the crown belongs to the people who will actually carry it, not to those who happen to be close to the throne at a particular moment. The wider picture this transfer points toward goes beyond one estate. It signals a change that has been building for some time. The quiet influence that certain figures had cultivated around the current reign, the carefully negotiated access, the private understandings reached in closed rooms, all of that has a shelf life. The future of the monarchy belongs to William and Catherine, and decisions like this one make that reality increasingly difficult to look away from. Princess Anne, by acting when she did, and in the way she did, forced the institution to face forward rather than sideways. She absorbed the anger, stood behind the decision, and made sure the outcome was secured before anyone could move to stop it. She did this so that William and Catherine would not have to fight this particular battle themselves. That is not a small thing. The people who lost this fight are now in an uncomfortable position with no clean exit. They cannot keep opposing the transfer without directly defying what Queen Elizabeth left in writing. They cannot frame the whole thing as an impulsive move by Princess Anne without looking like they failed to check the archives before launching a campaign, and they cannot suggest that Catherine is unready or undeserving without challenging the judgment of both the late Queen and one of the most consistently respected working royals in the institution's recent history. The silence that followed the archive discovery tells you most of what you need to know. The power struggle ended not with a public confrontation, but with a piece of paper that had been sitting in a file box for years, waiting for exactly this moment. What stays with me about this whole situation is how clearly it draws the line between influence and authority. Camilla's circle had influence. They had access, proximity, and the ability to shape things through quiet conversations and implied expectations. But Catherine now holds authority, the kind that is written down, legally binding, and backed by the explicit instructions of a monarch who planned for this long before the conflict existed. Influence can shift, fade, or be outmaneuvered. Real authority is considerably harder to dislodge. And Princess Anne understood that distinction better than anyone else in that building. Queen Elizabeth's handwriting on those pages, the specific conditions she outlined, the clarity of who she believes should protect this place and why, all of it points to a level of foresight that is hard not to notice. She understood the tensions that would come. She knew which people would push and which would try to redirect things for their own benefit. Rather than hoping the right outcome would emerge on its own, she left instructions. Specific, binding, legally enforceable instructions that sat quietly in an archive until the exact moment they were needed. That is not an accident. That is a woman who had spent 70 years watching how institutions fail when nobody thinks far enough ahead, and who was determined not to leave this particular question unresolved. For Camilla's family and the wider circle that had built expectations around the estate, the reckoning is probably still settling. The access they had cultivated, the quiet promises made in private conversations, the sense of guaranteed proximity, all of it dissolved the moment that Red Wax Seal was broken. There is no appeals process here. There is no workaround. Queen Elizabeth made her choice. Princess Anne carried it out. Catherine now carries the responsibility forward. Anyone still looking for a way to contest it has to explain why their judgment should carry more weight than Queen Elizabeth's own written instructions. Princess Anne's part in all of this is what I keep returning to. She did not have to do this. She could have stepped back, let the estate drift into whatever commercial or political currents were swirling around the current reign, and nobody would have held that against her. Instead, she walked directly into the line of fire, took the backlash, absorbed the anger from people who had every reason to come after her, and made sure the outcome was locked in before anyone could stop it. No press release, no managed photo opportunity, no carefully constructed public image. Just a signature on a document, and the willingness to stand behind it regardless of who objected. The image of Catherine walking those quiet paths, knowing she is now responsible for preserving something that meant everything to the late Queen, that is the emotional center of this story. It is not about winning. It is not about defeating rivals or proving a point in a palace argument. It is about accepting a weight that someone else chose you to carry, and carrying it with the steadiness the responsibility demands. Queen Elizabeth built this sanctuary as a place of peace. Catherine's job now is to keep it that way for the next generation and the one after that. Given what we have seen from her over the years, the steady focus, the refusal to be pulled into petty conflicts, the quiet dedication to the actual work, it is hard to argue with the choice. Years from now, historians looking back at this period probably will not dwell on the private meetings or the shattered teacup or the frantic phone calls between palace offices. What they will see is a moment when Princess Anne made a decision that protected Queen Elizabeth's legacy from becoming just another asset to be traded. A decision that put the future ahead of the present and permanence ahead of convenience. And they will see Catherine, Princess of Wales, standing on ground entrusted to her not through politics or favoritism, but because 2 generations of royal women looked at her and saw someone who would protect what mattered. The factions can keep whispering, the speculation will keep swirling, but the foundation underneath all of it is solid. Princess Anne made sure of that, and somewhere, you have to think Queen Elizabeth knew exactly what she was doing when she left those instructions behind. She understood the personalities, the pressures, and the quiet battles that would unfold once she was no longer there to oversee things directly. That small red leather envelope was not just a legal safeguard. It was a message from the past, delivered at precisely the right moment, reminding everyone that even in her absence, her will would hold. And it did.